The thunder of 150 motorcycles shook the windows of Redwood County Elementary School as leather-clad bikers surrounded the building like a protective army. 9-year-old Emily Carter was somewhere in those dark woods behind the playground, alone and terrified, and her father wasn't going to let another second pass without finding her. What started as a desperate phone call to his motorcycle club brothers turned into something that would make headlines across 3 states and force an entire community to confront a truth they'd been ignoring for months. The sheriff thought he'd seen everything in his 23 years on the force, but nothing could have prepared him for what those bikers were about to uncover in the darkness of those woods. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The morning had started like any other Tuesday at Redwood County Elementary, with yellow buses pulling up to the circular drive and children streaming through the double doors with backpacks bouncing against their shoulders. Emily Carter had walked into school that day wearing her favorite purple hoodie, the one with the sparkly unicorn on the front that her grandmother had given her for her 9th birthday 3 months ago. She'd clutched her lunchbox a little tighter than usual as she entered the building, her green eyes scanning the hallway with the cautious awareness of a child who'd learned to anticipate trouble before it found her. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as she made her way to her locker, trying to make herself as small and invisible as possible in the crowded corridor where voices echoed off tile floors and metal doors slammed with sharp, startling bangs. Emily had been dealing with the bullying for 7 months now, ever since she'd transferred to this school after her father's job brought them to this small town in Northern California. The problem started small, as these things often do, with whispered comments about her clothes being from the thrift store and jokes about the patches on her backpack that her father had sewn on himself because buying a new one wasn't in the budget. John Carter, who went by the nickname Grizz among his brothers in the Hells Angels, had raised Emily alone since her mother died in a car accident when Emily was just 3 years old. He worked as a mechanic at a garage on the edge of town, his hands perpetually stained with engine grease no matter how hard he scrubbed them, and he poured every bit of love and protection he had into his daughter's life with a fierceness that came from knowing how fragile and precious that life was. The main antagonist in Emily's daily struggle was a girl named Brittany Henderson, whose father owned the largest real estate development company in the county and whose mother sat on the school board. Brittany had the kind of confidence that came from never hearing the word no, from always getting the newest toys and the trendiest clothes, from understanding at a young age that her family's money and influence meant the rules other people followed didn't quite apply to her in the same way. She'd gathered a small group of followers around her, other girls who laughed at her jokes and echoed her cruelty, because being on Brittany's good side meant protection from becoming her next target. They'd started calling Emily names, hiding her belongings, and making sure she sat alone at lunch every single day, surrounded by empty chairs that might as well have been marked with invisible signs warning others to stay away. Emily had tried to tell her teacher, Mrs. Patricia Aldridge, a woman in her mid-50s who'd been teaching 4th grade for nearly 3 decades and had developed a kind of weary resignation about the social dynamics of 9- and 10-year-olds. Mrs. Aldridge had given Emily sympathetic looks and vague promises to keep an eye on things, but nothing ever really changed because Brittany was smart enough to do most of her tormenting in places where teachers couldn't see, in the bathroom stalls where she'd make fun of Emily's secondhand clothes, in the hallway corners where she'd knock books out of Emily's hands, on the playground where adult supervision was spread thin across too many children running in too many directions. The school's anti-bullying policy existed as a colorful poster in the main office, cheerful and ineffective as a Band-Aid on a broken bone. John Carter had noticed the changes in his daughter over the past months, the way she'd grown quieter and more withdrawn, the way she'd started complaining of stomachaches on school mornings, the way the light had dimmed in those green eyes that used to sparkle with curiosity and joy. He'd tried talking to the principal, a man named Richard Pemberton, who'd listened with polite concern and promised to look into the matter, but weeks went by with no improvement, and eventually John got the distinct impression that the school was more interested in protecting itself from liability than in protecting his daughter from harm. He'd felt his frustration growing like pressure in a sealed container, that familiar anger that came from being powerless to protect the person he loved most in this world, and he'd started considering more drastic measures, though he wasn't quite sure yet what form those measures might take. On this particular Tuesday morning, things came to a breaking point during recess when Emily was playing alone near the edge of the playground, drawing pictures in the dirt with a stick and trying to lose herself in imagination since she couldn't lose herself in friendship. Brittany and her crew of followers approached with that particular swagger that children adopt when they know they're about to do something mean and get away with it. Their voices carrying across the playground with cruel clarity as they started mocking Emily's drawing, calling it babyish and stupid, saying that her dead mother was probably embarrassed to have had such a pathetic daughter. The words hit Emily like physical blows, each one landing in the soft, vulnerable places where a child's self-worth lives, and she felt something inside her crack and splinter like ice under pressure. Emily dropped the stick and ran, not toward the school building where she might have found safety with an adult, but toward the tree line at the back of the playground where the maintained grass gave way to wild forest. Tears blurred her vision as she crashed through the underbrush, branches catching at her purple hoodie and scratching her arms. But she didn't stop running because the pain of the scratches was nothing compared to the pain of those words echoing in her head. She ran deeper into the woods, her sneakers slipping on pine needles and exposed roots, her breath coming in hitching sobs that made her chest hurt, and behind her, she could hear Brittany's mocking laughter fading as the distance grew and the forest swallowed her up in its shadowy embrace. Back at the school, it took nearly 15 minutes before anyone realized Emily was missing. Mrs. Aldridge did a head count after recess when the children lined up to go back inside, and her heart sank when she realized she was one short. She questioned the other students and got vague, unhelpful answers until finally one boy, a quiet kid named Marcus who'd always been kind to Emily, spoke up and said he'd seen her running toward the woods. The teacher's face went pale as she immediately informed the principal, and Richard Pemberton felt his stomach drop as he realized this situation had just escalated from manageable problem to potential catastrophe. He called the sheriff's office while one of his staff members called the number on file for Emily's father, and within minutes the peaceful morning at Redwood County Elementary had transformed into a scene of organized panic. John Carter was under the hood of a 1997 Ford pickup when his phone rang, his hands deep in the engine compartment as he worked to replace a worn serpentine belt. He almost didn't answer because he was in the middle of something and the caller ID showed the school's number, but something made him wipe his hands on a rag and take the call anyway. The voice on the other end belonged to the school's secretary, and her words came out in a rush that made his blood run cold. His daughter had run into the woods. They didn't know exactly when. She'd been upset about something. They were sorry. The sheriff was on his way. John didn't remember hanging up the phone or telling his boss he was leaving or getting in his truck, but suddenly he was driving too fast down Main Street with his heart pounding so hard he could feel it in his throat. The drive to the school took 8 minutes that felt like 8 hours, and when John pulled into the parking lot, he saw Sheriff Mark Dalton's cruiser already there along with another deputy's vehicle. He parked haphazardly and ran toward the building where a small crowd had gathered near the tree line at the back of the playground. Sheriff Dalton was a tall man in his early 50s with steel-gray hair and a face weathered by decades of dealing with the full spectrum of human behavior in a rural county. He turned as John approached, and the two men locked eyes with the understanding of people who'd known each other for years despite moving in very different circles. The sheriff knew about John's affiliation with the Hells Angels, had even pulled him over once or twice over the years for minor traffic violations, but there'd never been any real trouble, and both men maintained a relationship of wary mutual respect. "We've got people searching," Sheriff Dalton said without preamble, gesturing toward the woods where several deputies and school staff members were calling Emily's name. "But these woods go on for miles, and she's got a good head start. We've called for additional units, and I've got search and rescue on standby." His voice was calm and professional, the tone of someone who'd handled crises before. But John could see the concern in the older man's eyes because they both knew how quickly a child could get lost in those woods, how the temperature would drop once the sun went down, how there were cliffs and streams and 100 other dangers waiting in that wilderness. John Carter stood at the edge of the tree line staring into the forest that had swallowed his daughter, and he felt a rage building inside him that was so intense it almost overwhelmed the fear. This was his baby girl out there, scared and alone. And she was out there because the school had failed to protect her, because adults who should have been watching had let bullies torment her until she couldn't take it anymore. He pulled out his phone with shaking hands and scrolled through his contacts until he found the number for Clayton Chains Morrison, the president of his charter of the Hells Angels. When Chains answered, John's voice was rough with emotion as he explained the situation, and on the other end of the line, there was a moment of silence before Chains spoke 3 words that sent a jolt of hope through John's chest. "We're coming, brother." Within 20 minutes, the first motorcycles started arriving at Redwood County Elementary. They came from the local clubhouse initially, the members who'd been hanging around the garage working on their bikes or just passing time with their brothers. But word spread fast through the network, phone calls and text messages going out to members across the region. And soon they were coming from 40 miles away, some from even farther, because when one of their brothers needed help, you dropped what you were doing and you showed up. The rumble of the engines was like thunder rolling across the landscape, a deep thrumming sound that made windows vibrate and drew people out of their houses to see what was happening. Parents picking up their children from school stopped and stared as the motorcycles poured into the parking lot. Riders in leather vests adorned with patches and colors that declared their allegiance and their brotherhood. Clayton Morrison was a man in his late 40s, built like a bull, with arms covered in tattoos and a beard that reached halfway down his chest. He'd served 2 tours in Afghanistan before coming home and finding a different kind of family in the motorcycle club, and he understood loyalty and brotherhood in ways that most people never would. He parked his bike and walked over to where John was standing with the sheriff, and the 2 men embraced briefly before Chains turned to assess the situation. "Tell me what you need," he said to John, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to making decisions and having people follow them. Sheriff Dalton watched the scene unfolding with growing amazement, tinged with concern. He'd never seen anything quite like this. Dozens of bikers arriving with the clear intention of helping search for a missing child, and he wasn't quite sure how to handle it from a law enforcement perspective. These were members of the Hells Angels, an organization that law enforcement generally viewed with suspicion and often outright hostility. But right now they were offering manpower and resources for a search that desperately needed both. The sheriff made a quick decision that he'd probably question later, but felt right in the moment. "If you're here to help find this girl, then we need to organize this properly," he said, his voice carrying across the parking lot. "We can't have people just running into those woods in every direction. We need a coordinated search pattern." What happened next would become the stuff of local legend, a story that would be retold in diners and bars across Redwood County for years to come. Clayton Morrison took charge of organizing the bikers into search teams, using his military experience to create an efficient grid pattern that would cover the maximum amount of territory in the shortest time. Sheriff Dalton provided maps of the area and marked off sections, trying to focus the search on the most likely directions Emily might have gone. The bikers split into groups of 8 or 10, each team taking a different vector into the woods, and they moved with a purpose and efficiency that impressed even the skeptical deputies who'd initially viewed their arrival with alarm. By the time the search was fully organized, there were 150 bikers spread out across the tree line, creating a human chain that stretched along the entire back of the school property. They moved into the woods calling Emily's name, their deep voices echoing through the trees, and the sound of it was both comforting and overwhelming. John Carter was in the center group, his heart in his throat as he pushed through underbrush and climbed over fallen logs, his eyes scanning constantly for any sign of his daughter. Every purple flower or piece of trash his eyes landed on caused his heart to skip, thinking for a split second it might be Emily's hoodie, but so far there'd been nothing but trees and more trees and the growing darkness as the afternoon wore on. The search had been going for about an hour when one of the teams, led by a member named Raymond Razor Collins, found the first real clue. It was a piece of purple fabric caught on a thorny bush about a quarter mile into the woods, torn from what was clearly a child's sweatshirt. Razor immediately radioed back to the main group, and the searchers began to converge on that location, refocusing their efforts in that direction. John felt a surge of hope mixed with terror when he saw the fabric, recognizing it instantly as being from Emily's unicorn hoodie, and he pushed forward with renewed urgency, his voice hoarse from calling his daughter's name over and over. Meanwhile, deeper in the woods, Emily had finally stopped running. She'd collapsed at the base of a large oak tree, her body shaking with sobs, her purple hoodie torn and her arms scratched from the branches she'd crashed through in her blind panic. The anger and hurt she'd felt back at school had given way to fear as she'd realized how far she'd run and how lost she was. The trees all looked the same in every direction, and the sounds of the school playground had faded away completely, replaced by the rustling of leaves and the distant calls of birds that sounded almost mocking in their cheerfulness. Emily pulled her knees to her chest and wrapped her arms around them, making herself as small as possible, and for the first time in her life, she understood what true loneliness felt like, a vast emptiness that seemed to stretch out in all directions with no end in sight. She thought about her father, about how worried he must be, and fresh tears rolled down her cheeks because she'd made everything worse by running away. She thought about her mother, whose face she could barely remember anymore except in photographs, and she wondered if her mother would be disappointed in her for not being strong enough to handle Brittany's cruelty. The words Brittany had said about her mother being embarrassed kept playing in her head like a broken record, and even though part of Emily knew they weren't true, another part of her wondered if maybe there was some truth to them, if maybe she really was as pathetic and worthless as Brittany said. As the afternoon shadows grew longer and the temperature began to drop, Emily heard something that made her lift her head. At first she thought she was imagining it, but then she heard it again, the distant rumble of motorcycle engines. The sound grew louder, and mixed with it she could hear voices calling her name, men's voices, deep and strong, and something about the sound made her think of her father. She tried to call back, but her voice came out as barely more than a whisper, her throat raw from crying. So she pushed herself to her feet and started moving toward the sound, stumbling over roots and pushing past branches, her heart pounding with a mixture of hope and lingering fear. Back at the school, the parking lot had become a makeshift command center. Sheriff Dalton had set up a folding table with maps spread across it, and he was coordinating with his deputies and the search teams via radio. News vans from regional television stations had started arriving, drawn by the unusual spectacle of over 100 bikers conducting a search and rescue operation. Principal Pemberton hovered nervously nearby, very aware that his school was at the center of a situation that was rapidly becoming a public relations nightmare. Parents who'd heard about what was happening had started gathering at the school, some to offer help, others simply to watch the drama unfold, and the whole scene had taken on a surreal quality that nobody quite knew how to process. One person who was notably absent from the parking lot was Brittany Henderson, whose parents had swept her away as soon as they'd heard what happened. Robert Henderson had arrived in his luxury sedan, spoken briefly with Principal Pemberton in hushed, urgent tones, and then left with his daughter without talking to any of the deputies or explaining what Brittany might know about Emily's state of mind before she ran. Sheriff Dalton had noticed this and made a mental note to follow up on it later, because in his experience, people who left a scene that quickly usually had something they didn't want to discuss. It was Clayton Morrison's team that found Emily first. They'd been following the direction indicated by the torn fabric and were spread out in a line about 15 feet apart from each other, moving methodically through the underbrush and calling Emily's name every 30 seconds. Chains heard a small sound off to his right, barely audible over the rustle of leaves and the crunch of his boots on the forest floor, and he held up a hand to signal his team to stop. In the silence that followed, he heard it again, a child's voice, weak and scared, saying hello. Chains moved toward the sound with his heart pounding, and then he saw her, a small figure in a torn purple hoodie stumbling between the trees toward them. "I've got her," Chains shouted into his radio as he rushed forward. Emily looked up at this huge, bearded man in leather and patches, and for a moment fear flickered across her face because she'd been taught to be wary of strangers, especially ones who looked like they'd stepped out of a movie about motorcycle gangs. But then she saw the kindness in his eyes and the relief on his face, and when he knelt down to her level and asked gently if she was Emily Carter, she nodded and started crying again, this time with relief. Chains didn't hesitate. He scooped her up in his arms like she weighed nothing at all, and he carried her back toward where the rest of the search teams were converging, talking to her in a soft voice the whole time, telling her she was safe now, telling her that her daddy was looking for her and would be so happy to see her. The radio crackled with the news that Emily had been found, and a cheer went up from the searchers that could probably be heard back at the school. John Carter heard the news and felt his knees go weak with relief, so intense It was almost painful. He ran in the direction Chains had indicated, crashing through the underbrush with no regard for the branches whipping at his face. And when he finally saw his daughter in the other man's arms, he let out a sound that was half sob, half laugh. Chains set Emily down gently, and she ran to her father, throwing her arms around his waist and burying her face in his shirt. John dropped to his knees and held her, one hand cradling the back of her head, and for a long moment neither of them could speak through their tears. "I'm sorry, Daddy," Emily finally whispered against his chest. "I'm so sorry I ran away." John pulled back just enough to look at her face, using his thumbs to wipe away her tears, and he shook his head firmly. "You have nothing to be sorry for, sweetheart," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Nothing that happened today was your fault. Do you understand me? None of this was your fault." Emily nodded, but John could see in her eyes that she didn't quite believe him, and he felt his anger at the situation rekindling, burning away the relief and leaving behind a cold determination to make sure this never happened again. The walk back to the school took about 30 minutes, with Emily riding on her father's shoulders even though she was really getting too big for that, her hands gripping his hair while he held her legs steady. The bikers formed a protective circle around them as they moved through the woods, and there was something almost ceremonial about the procession, this small girl being carried by her father while surrounded by a rough, tough men who dropped everything to help find her. When they emerged from the tree line into the playground area, another cheer went up from the crowd that had gathered, and flashbulbs started going off as the news photographers captured the moment. Sheriff Dalton was waiting at the edge of the woods, and he approached with a paramedic team that had been standing by. Emily was checked over while sitting on her father's lap, the medic examining her scratches and bruises and determining that while she was scared and exhausted, she was fundamentally okay. The sheriff watched the reunion with mixed emotions, genuinely happy that the girl had been found safe, but also very aware that there were serious questions that needed to be answered about how and why this had happened in the first place. He caught John Carter's eye and gave him a nod that communicated both relief and a promise that this conversation wasn't over. Principal Pemberton approached hesitantly, his face pale and drawn, and he started to say something about being glad Emily was safe, but John cut him off with a look that could have melted steel. "Not now," John said quietly, his voice carrying a warning that made the principal step back. "Not here, and not in front of my daughter. But you and I are going to have a very serious conversation about what's been happening at your school." The principal nodded and retreated, and several of the bikers who'd overheard the exchange exchanged knowing looks, because they all had a pretty good idea what John was referring to, and they'd all seen enough of the world to know exactly how these situations usually played out. As the crowd began to disperse and the bikers started heading back to their motorcycles, Sheriff Dalton pulled Clayton Morrison aside. "I need to talk to you and some of your people," the sheriff said, his tone making it clear this was a request that shouldn't be refused. Chains nodded and gathered a few of his senior members, and they followed the sheriff to a quiet area away from the news cameras. What happened in that conversation would turn out to be almost as significant as the search itself, because Sheriff Dalton was about to learn something that would completely change his understanding of the situation. "Before we all go our separate ways, I need to know exactly what happened at this school today," Sheriff Dalton said, looking at the assembled bikers with an expression that was more curious than accusatory. "I need to understand what drove that little girl into those woods." There was a moment of silence, and then one of the bikers, a younger member named Kevin Keys Patterson who had a daughter about Emily's age, spoke up. "With respect, Sheriff, maybe you should be asking that question to the kids who were tormenting her, not to us," he said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "We've been hearing things from some of the other kids whose parents we know, and what's been happening to Emily Carter ain't right." The sheriff's attention sharpened at this, and over the next 20 minutes, he listened as several of the bikers shared what they'd learned, pieces of a puzzle they'd started putting together from conversations with their own children who attended the same school, from gossip they'd heard around town, from connecting dots that the school administration had apparently chosen to ignore. They told him about Brittany Henderson and her crew, about the systematic bullying that had been going on for months, about how Emily had tried to report it and been essentially dismissed, about how the school seemed more interested in protecting the reputation of certain wealthy families than in protecting vulnerable kids. Sheriff Dalton felt his jaw tightening as he listened, because he was starting to see the outline of something that made his cop instincts tingle. He'd known the Henderson family for years, had always found Robert Henderson to be arrogant and entitled, but never thought much of it. But now he was wondering what else might be going on beneath the surface. "I'm going to need to talk to the Henderson girl," he said slowly, almost to himself. "And I'm going to need to do it properly, with her parents present and probably with a social worker on hand." He looked at the bikers with newfound respect. "You all did a good thing today. I won't forget it." What Sheriff Dalton didn't know yet, what nobody knew yet, was that the situation with Brittany Henderson was far more complicated than simple childhood meanness. Over the next few days, as the sheriff began his investigation into the bullying incident, he would uncover a story that would shock the entire community and force everyone to confront some uncomfortable truths about what had been happening behind closed doors in one of the county's most prominent families. The investigation began the next morning when Sheriff Dalton showed up at Redwood County Elementary with a child psychologist named Dr. Rebecca Winters and a female deputy to interview students who'd witnessed the bullying. Principal Pemberton was cooperative, too cooperative really, the kind of cooperation that comes from knowing you're in trouble and trying to minimize the damage. The sheriff interviewed a dozen students throughout the day, and a picture began to emerge of systematic harassment that had been going on for the better part of the school year, not just against Emily, but against several other students as well, all orchestrated by Brittany Henderson and her group of followers. But it was during the interview with Marcus, the quiet boy who'd first reported seeing Emily run into the woods, that Sheriff Dalton heard something that made him sit up straighter in his chair. Marcus was hesitant at first, clearly scared of getting in trouble or becoming the next target. But with gentle encouragement from Dr. Winters, he began to talk about things he'd heard Brittany say, not just the mean comments about Emily, but disturbing statements about her own home life. He mentioned how Brittany had talked about her parents fighting all the time, about her father yelling and throwing things, about hiding in her closet when things got scary at home, about how she'd come to school with bruises sometimes that she'd explain away as clumsiness or sports injuries. Sheriff Dalton exchanged a meaningful look with Dr. Winters because they both recognized what they were hearing. The psychologist had seen it countless times before, the cycle where children who were being hurt at home would turn around and hurt others at school, acting out their trauma in the only way they knew how. It didn't excuse Brittany's behavior toward Emily, but it certainly explained it, and more importantly, it raised serious red flags about what might be happening in the Henderson household. The sheriff made a decision right there in that school office, a decision that would require careful navigation of the county's power structure, but was absolutely necessary. He was going to investigate Robert Henderson. The investigation into the Henderson family was complicated by the fact that Robert Henderson had connections throughout the county, including to several members of the County Board of Supervisors and even to the district attorney's office. But Sheriff Dalton had been in law enforcement long enough to know how to conduct a sensitive investigation, and he started by reaching out to contacts in the state's Child Protective Services Division. What he learned in those conversations confirmed his worst suspicions. There had been 3 previous reports made about the Henderson household over the past 2 years, reports from concerned teachers and neighbors about Brittany's concerning behavior and occasional unexplained injuries. But each time the reports had been closed without action, often after pressure from Robert Henderson's lawyers. Sheriff Dalton brought this information to the county's supervising judge, Margaret Chun, a woman known for her integrity and her refusal to be swayed by political pressure. Judge Chun reviewed the evidence and authorized a welfare check on the Henderson household, along with formal interviews with Brittany conducted by trained child welfare specialists. The interviews took place over several days in a neutral location with only the specialists present, following protocols designed to make children feel safe enough to speak truthfully about their home situations, and what Brittany finally revealed was heartbreaking. The girl described a household ruled by her father's anger, where minor infractions could trigger explosive rages that left everyone walking on eggshells. She talked about her mother's silent complicity, the way Amanda Henderson would turn away and pretend not to see when her husband lost control. Brittany described instances of being grabbed roughly, of being locked in her room for hours as punishment, of hearing her mother crying behind closed doors, of learning that the only way to feel powerful in a situation where she felt completely powerless was to exert control over others at school. The child welfare specialists recognized classic patterns of emotional and physical abuse, and they documented everything with the careful thoroughness that such serious allegations required. When confronted with these allegations, Robert Henderson reacted exactly as Sheriff Dalton had expected he would, with bluster and threats and immediate calls to his lawyer. But Judge Chun had been very careful about following proper procedures, and the evidence was substantial enough that even Henderson's high-powered attorney couldn't simply make it disappear. The case began moving through the family court system, with Brittany being placed temporarily with her maternal grandmother while the full investigation continued. The news of Robert Henderson's arrest on child endangerment charges hit Redwood County like a bomb, shattering the carefully maintained image of one of the community's most prominent families and forcing people to reckon with the fact that money and status didn't prevent abuse. They often just made it easier to hide. For Emily Carter, the days following her rescue were complicated and confusing. She was glad to be home safe with her father, glad that she didn't have to go back to school right away because the principal had suggested she take a few days off to recover, but she was also struggling to process everything that had happened. She'd seen the news coverage about the bikers coming to find her, seen the footage of herself being carried out of the woods surrounded by all those protective figures in leather, and she didn't quite know what to make of it. Part of her felt embarrassed that she'd needed to be rescued, that her moment of weakness had become such a public spectacle, but another part of her felt something she hadn't felt in a long time, the sense of being protected and valued and worth making a fuss over. John Carter was dealing with his own complicated emotions. He was grateful beyond words for his brothers in the club who'd dropped everything to help find his daughter, and he was determined to make sure Emily never felt unsafe at school again. But he was also grappling with anger at the system that had failed to protect her in the first place. The school district had reached out through their lawyers, making noises about policy reviews and improved anti-bullying measures, the kind of bureaucratic promises that sounded good on paper but didn't necessarily translate to real change. John had contacted a lawyer himself, not because he wanted to sue necessarily, but because he wanted to make sure the school understood that there would be consequences if they didn't take concrete steps to address the problems. The story of Emily's rescue had spread far beyond Redwood County, picked up by state media, and eventually by national news outlets who were drawn to the compelling narrative of outlaw bikers coming together to save a bullied child. The Hells Angels didn't typically get positive media coverage, so the attention was both welcome and strange for the members who'd participated in the search. Clayton Morrison found himself doing interviews with reporters who seemed surprised to discover that bikers were capable of compassion and heroism, and he used the opportunity to talk about the brotherhood and loyalty that defined the club, about how they might look rough on the outside, but they took care of their own and their communities. Several weeks after the incident, when things had settled down somewhat, and Emily had returned to school with the promise of closer monitoring by administration, Sheriff Dalton invited John Carter and Clayton Morrison to his office for a conversation. The three men sat in the sheriff's modest office with its filing cabinets and framed commendations, and there was a moment of almost awkward silence before the sheriff spoke. "I wanted to thank you both, officially," he said, his weathered face serious. "What you all did that day, it was remarkable. I've been in law enforcement for 23 years, and I've never seen a community response quite like that." John nodded his acknowledgement, but didn't say much, still processing his own feelings about everything. Chains leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, and fixed the sheriff with an intense look. "That little girl is family," he said simply. "You don't abandon family when they need you. That's what we're about, underneath all the leather and the noise. We're about loyalty and protection and showing up when it matters." Sheriff Dalton found himself nodding in agreement, his preconceptions about outlaw motorcycle clubs being challenged by the reality of what he'd witnessed. "I think I'm starting to understand that," he said quietly. The sheriff then shared what he'd learned about the Henderson situation, being careful not to reveal details that were protected by the ongoing investigation, but giving enough information to help John and Emily understand that Brittany's cruelty hadn't emerged from nowhere. He explained about the cycle of abuse, about how hurt children often hurt other children, about how the system had failed Brittany just as it had failed Emily, albeit in very different ways. John listened with a complicated expression, because part of him wanted to maintain his anger at the girl who'd tormented his daughter, but another part of him felt a reluctant sympathy for a child who'd been living with her own terror at home. "What happens to her now?" John asked, referring to Brittany. Sheriff Dalton sighed heavily. That's up to the family court and child protective services, he said. Her father is facing charges and is likely going to serve time. Her mother is going through her own legal issues and is in therapy. Brittany's living with her grandmother and getting counseling. The hope is that with proper support and intervention, she can break the cycle and become a healthier person. He paused, then added, but that doesn't erase what she did to Emily. Those are separate issues, and the school is implementing real consequences for the bullying, not just empty promises. Emily herself was struggling with complicated feelings about Brittany. Her father had sat her down and explained, in age-appropriate terms, about how sometimes kids who are mean are dealing with bad things at home, how that doesn't make their meanness okay, but helps explain why they do it. Emily tried to understand, tried to feel compassion, but it was hard because the wounds were still fresh and the memories of being mocked and excluded still hurt. She'd started seeing a counselor herself, a kind woman named Dr. Stevens who specialized in working with children who'd experienced bullying. And slowly Emily was beginning to process her feelings and rebuild her sense of self-worth that had been so damaged by months of harassment. The school district, facing potential legal action and significant public pressure, implemented a comprehensive new anti-bullying program that included better training for teachers on recognizing and responding to harassment, a clear reporting system that couldn't be easily dismissed or ignored, and regular check-ins with students who'd been identified as vulnerable. Principal Pemberton, whose negligent handling of Emily's situation had been made very public, quietly announced his retirement at the end of the school year. And there was a general sense that the district was finally taking the issue seriously because they'd been forced by circumstances they could no longer control. The community reaction to everything that had happened was mixed and revealing. Some people praised the bikers for their heroic response and questioned why it had taken an outlaw motorcycle club to do what the school system should have been doing all along. Others were uncomfortable with the attention and sympathy the Hells Angels were receiving, preferring to maintain their preconceived notions about bikers being dangerous criminals regardless of evidence to the contrary. There were difficult conversations happening in living rooms and coffee shops across Redwood County about class, about bullying, about abuse, about how communities protect some children while failing others, about who gets the benefit of the doubt and who doesn't. For the members of the Hells Angels who'd participated in the search, life gradually returned to normal, though the bond between them felt somehow deeper after sharing that experience. They continued with their regular activities, working on their bikes and hanging out at the clubhouse and riding together on weekends. But there was an additional sense of pride in what they'd accomplished together. Several members received thank you cards from Emily, each one featuring crayon drawings of motorcycles and heartfelt messages in a child's careful handwriting, and these cards were displayed prominently in the clubhouse like badges of honor. John Carter found himself invited to spend more time at the clubhouse after the incident, his status within the brotherhood elevated by the shared experience of that desperate day. He'd been a member for years, but had always kept somewhat separate because of his responsibilities as a single father. But now his brothers made it clear that Emily was welcome too, that the clubhouse was a place where she could feel safe and protected. Emily was initially shy around the rough-looking men with their tattoos and loud voices. But gradually, she warmed up as she realized that beneath the intimidating exteriors were people who genuinely cared about her well-being. One Saturday afternoon, about 2 months after the incident, the club organized a benefit ride to raise money for anti-bullying programs in local schools. Hundreds of motorcycles from multiple clubs across the region showed up, creating a parade that stretched for miles and raised over $50,000 for the cause. Emily rode on the back of her father's bike for part of the route, wearing a miniature leather vest that the club had made specially for her, complete with a patch that read, "Forever Family," in bright, embroidered letters. The sight of this small girl riding confidently behind her father, surrounded by an army of protective bikers, became one of the most iconic images from the entire situation, a symbol of unexpected heroism and community solidarity. Sheriff Dalton attended the benefit ride in an unofficial capacity, riding his own personal motorcycle rather than his cruiser, and afterwards he and Clayton Morrison had a long conversation about community policing and building bridges between law enforcement and groups that had traditionally viewed each other with suspicion. They talked about forming an advisory council that would include representatives from the motorcycle clubs to discuss community safety issues and ways to work together rather than at cross purposes. It was an unconventional idea that would face resistance from both sides, but both men felt that the events surrounding Emily's rescue had proven that cooperation was possible when people focused on shared values rather than surface differences. The local news media continued to follow up on the story over the following months, checking in on Emily's progress and documenting the changes being implemented at the school. Emily gave one carefully supervised interview where she talked about feeling safer now and being glad that other kids wouldn't have to go through what she'd experienced. She spoke briefly about the bikers who'd found her, calling them heroes in that simple, straightforward way children have of identifying the essential truth of things, and the clip went viral online, generating millions of views and sparking broader conversations about masculinity, community responsibility, and the ways people defy stereotypes. Brittany Henderson's story took a different trajectory, one that was more private and less dramatic, but equally important. In therapy, she began to unpack the trauma she'd experienced and understand the connections between her home life and her behavior at school. It was slow, difficult work, and there were setbacks along the way, but gradually she began to show signs of genuine change. Her grandmother, a retired teacher named Dorothy Wilson, provided the stable, loving environment Brittany had been lacking, with clear boundaries and consistent affection that helped the girl start to feel secure for perhaps the first time in her life. Eventually, with support from her therapist, Brittany wrote a letter of apology to Emily, not because anyone forced her to, but because she'd reached a point in her healing where she needed to acknowledge the harm she'd caused. Emily received the letter with mixed feelings, reading the carefully written words where Brittany expressed genuine remorse and explained, without making excuses, some of what she'd been dealing with. John helped his daughter think through her response, and eventually Emily wrote back, a short note that acknowledged the apology without necessarily offering immediate forgiveness, but left the door open for potential healing in the future. The two girls would never be friends. The damage had been too deep for that. But there was at least the possibility that they could coexist in the same school without active hostility, which was perhaps the best outcome anyone could reasonably hope for given the circumstances. The legal proceedings against Robert Henderson moved slowly through the court system, as these cases always do, but eventually he pled guilty to several counts of child endangerment and was sentenced to 2 years in county jail, followed by 3 years of supervised probation and mandatory anger management counseling. His real estate empire crumbled during the scandal, clients abandoning him and business partners distancing themselves, and the Henderson name that had once carried such weight in Redwood County became associated with shame and failure. Amanda Henderson divorced him while he was awaiting sentencing, moving with her mother and Brittany to a smaller house in a different part of the county and trying to rebuild their lives away from the wreckage. For Emily, the months following her rescue became a process of slowly regaining confidence and learning to trust again. She made some new friends at school, kids who'd seen her story in the news and were drawn to her because of it or despite it, and she gradually came out of her shell as she realized that not everyone was going to hurt her the way Brittany had. She joined an after-school art program and discovered she had a talent for painting, creating colorful canvases that her father hung proudly throughout their small house. The nightmares about being chased through the woods faded slowly, replaced by dreams where she was safe and protected and surrounded by people who cared about her. The relationship between Emily and the motorcycle club became an ongoing part of her life rather than just a dramatic one-time event. She attended club barbecues and birthday parties, became comfortable around the roar of engines and the smell of leather and motor oil, learned about motorcycle maintenance by watching the members work on their bikes in the garage. The men of the club, many of whom had children of their own, treated her with a protective affection that filled some of the void left by her mother's absence, and Emily thrived under the attention and acceptance. One particularly meaningful moment came about 6 months after the rescue, when Emily approached Clayton Morrison at a club gathering and asked if he would teach her how to ride. She was still too young for a real motorcycle, of course, but Chains found an old dirt bike and spent several Saturday afternoons in an empty field teaching her the basics, how to balance and turn and control the throttle, patiently correcting her mistakes and celebrating her small victories. John watched from the sidelines, his heart swelling with pride and gratitude as he saw his daughter's confidence growing with each successful lap around the field. And he thought about how this rough group of bikers had given his daughter something precious, the understanding that she was worth protecting and celebrating and investing time in. The story of Emily Carter and the 150 bikers who came to find her became one of those rare news stories that actually made people feel hopeful about humanity, a counterpoint to the endless stream of negativity and division that dominated headlines. It was shared widely on social media, discussed in schools as an example of community cooperation, and even mentioned in a congressional hearing about bullying prevention programs. The image of those bikers surrounding the woods, forming a protective barrier while searching for a frightened child, became symbolic of something larger, a reminder that people are often more complex and capable of goodness than stereotypes suggest. Sheriff Mark Dalton, reflecting on the events in an interview a year later, said something that captured what many people felt about the situation. "We learned a lot of lessons that day," he said, his weathered face thoughtful. "We learned that help can come from unexpected places. We learned that judging people based on appearance or reputation can blind us to their humanity. We learned that communities work best when we set aside our prejudices and focus on our shared values. And we learned that sometimes the people society views as outsiders are the ones most willing to step up when someone needs help." John Carter continued to work as a mechanic, continued to ride with his brothers in the Hells Angels, continued to raise his daughter with the same fierce protective love that had driven him to make that phone call on the worst day of his life. He never forgot how quickly his brothers had responded when he needed them, how they'd dropped everything to help search for Emily, how they'd proven that the bonds of brotherhood meant something real and tangible. The experience deepened his commitment to the club and strengthened his belief that family, whether bound by blood or by choice, was the most important thing in the world. Emily grew up surrounded by this extended family of bikers, learning lessons about loyalty and courage and standing up for people who needed help. She never forgot those hours she'd spent lost in the woods, crying and afraid. But she also never forgot the sound of motorcycles rumbling through the trees, the feeling of being lifted up by strong arms, the sight of her father's face when he finally reached her. These memories shaped her understanding of what it meant to be part of a community, what it meant to have people who would drop everything to come find you when you were lost. Years later, when Emily was older and telling her own children about that day, she would describe it as the moment she learned that family wasn't just about who you were related to by blood, but about who showed up when you needed them most. She would talk about the bikers who'd spent hours searching through the woods for a little girl they'd never met, about the sheriff who'd set aside his preconceptions to coordinate with people he was supposed to view as adversaries, about the community that had finally woken up and paid attention to problems they'd been ignoring for too long. And she would tell her children that the most important thing she'd learned was that people were complicated and surprising and often much better than the labels society tried to put on them. The incident left lasting changes in Redwood County. The school district's anti-bullying programs, implemented in the aftermath of Emily's case, became a model that other districts studied and adapted. The relationship between law enforcement and the local motorcycle clubs evolved into something more cooperative and less antagonistic, with regular communication and occasional joint community service projects. The county's approach to investigating child welfare complaints became more rigorous and less influenced by the wealth or status of the families involved, though this remained an ongoing struggle requiring constant vigilance. Clayton Morrison, reflecting on the day years later, said that searching for Emily had reminded him of why he'd joined the club in the first place, the sense of being part of something larger than himself, the brotherhood that transcended individual differences and united people around shared values of loyalty and protection and standing up for those who couldn't stand up for themselves. He kept one of Emily's crayon drawings framed on his desk at the clubhouse, a simple picture of a little girl holding hands with what appeared to be angels with beards and wings that looked suspiciously like motorcycle wheels, and he would sometimes look at it and smile, remembering the fear and the triumph and the strange, beautiful chaos of that September afternoon. The purple hoodie that Emily had been wearing, torn and stained from her run through the woods, was eventually framed and displayed in the clubhouse, not as a trophy, but as a reminder of what they'd accomplished together and why it had mattered. New members who joined the club would ask about it. and the story would be told again, details becoming slightly embellished over time as stories do, but the essential truth remaining unchanged, the truth that a frightened child had run into the woods and a community had mobilized to bring her home, that people who were supposed to be outsiders had proven themselves to be exactly what heroes looked like when they weren't prettied up for television. Emily herself would grow up to become a social worker specializing in helping children who'd experienced bullying and abuse, taking the pain of her own experience and transforming it into a career dedicated to helping others. She would sometimes speak at schools about her story, using it to help other children understand that they weren't alone, that help existed even when it seemed hopeless, that communities could change when enough people decided that protecting children was more important than maintaining convenient fictions. And she would always emphasize that her rescue wasn't just about one dramatic day, but about all the people who'd refused to look away from an uncomfortable truth, who'd chosen action over indifference, who'd proven that ordinary people could do extraordinary things when they decided that a child's safety and dignity mattered more than their own comfort. The legacy of that September day lived on in countless small ways throughout Redwood County. In the school hallways where teachers now paid closer attention to the social dynamics among students and intervened more quickly when they saw signs of bullying. In the sheriff's office where deputies were trained to look beyond surface appearances and question their own assumptions about who deserved protection and who deserved suspicion. In the motorcycle clubhouse where members continued to find meaning and purpose in protecting their community, not despite their rough exterior, but through a deep understanding that strength was meant to be used in service of the vulnerable. And in the Carter household, where a young girl grew up knowing that she was surrounded by people who loved her enough to search through miles of forest just to bring her home safely, who valued her enough to change systems that had failed her, who saw her worth even when she couldn't see it herself. The story concluded not with a dramatic finale, but with the quiet satisfaction of lives lived well in the aftermath of crisis. John Carter and his daughter Emily continuing their journey together, supported by an unconventional but deeply loyal extended family. The members of the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club going about their lives with the knowledge that they'd made a real difference when it mattered most. Sheriff Dalton working to build bridges between different segments of his community, learning that law and order sometimes looked different than what he'd been taught in the academy. And Brittany Henderson, in her own private struggle toward healing, slowly learning that she could break the cycle of hurt that had defined her early years and become someone capable of kindness rather than cruelty. The local newspaper published a feature article on the one-year anniversary of Emily's rescue, including photographs from that day and follow-up interviews with the key participants. The article ended with a quote from Emily herself, who'd been asked what she wanted people to remember about her story. Her answer, spoken with the wisdom of someone who'd learned hard lessons young, was simple but profound. She said that she wanted people to remember that everyone is fighting battles others can't see, that judgment should be replaced with compassion, and that real heroes don't always look like what you expect them to look like. Sometimes, she said, heroes wear leather jackets and ride motorcycles and have beards down to their chests. And sometimes the scariest-looking people turn out to be the safest people to be around when you really need help. In the end, the story of Emily Carter and the 150 bikers who searched for her was less about one dramatic rescue and more about what happens when a community decides to care, really care, about protecting its most vulnerable members. It was about the ripple effects of one child's desperate flight into the woods, how that moment of crisis forced people to confront truths they'd been avoiding, how it challenged assumptions and broke down barriers and created unexpected alliances. It was about the complicated reality that hurt people, but that cycle can be broken with intervention and support. It was about how organizations that society often dismisses or fears can be sources of profound good when given the chance. And it was about a little girl who ran into the woods crying and emerged hours later carried on the shoulders of rough men who'd proven themselves to be gentle giants, surrounded by the thunder of 150 motorcycles that had come together to bring one lost child home.